Sisters Month about 3 years ago. The purpose of the month is to recognize, to memorialize, and to celebrate the contributions in the abolition movement of Norwich natives Sarah and Mary Harris, sisters who were among Prudence Crandall's first students when she established her academy for all Black young women. This is the last event of this month's activities, and we're so pleased to have Dale here. He will describe the research that he's done on the careers of the sisters following the episodes at the school. They went on to solidify their legacies in the abolitionist movement. We're very lucky in Norwich to have Dale as city historian. You've been a city historian for quite some time.
30 years.
Oh, I was going to try and compare it to when the town was founded. How many years ago was the town founded? About 300
It depends on what you regard as the town.
And one of the reasons we're so lucky is that Dale is a social historian. A social historian does not do research on party culture. Through the years, a social historian recognizes the contributions of people who often don't make it into the history books, who aren't the big people, who don't belong to the social elite, people who may be unrecognized but are nonetheless remarkable. And in Norwich, we have an abundance of such people. So I want to thank Dale for years of contributions, of exquisite research, and for your willingness to participate in our sisters.
Oh, shucks.
Thank you.
So just give up now. It's hard to beat that. I just wanted, some of you were here for the talk on Francis Hawkins, and just wanted to say one of the challenges here is that Frances Hawkins is extremely well documented, and here's why. She died in 1869. The London County Historical Society was founded in 1870. One of the founders was her half-brother, Henry P. Haven, the so-called Prince of Wales, one of the big whaling magnates in New London. He lived with her or next door to her. She was single. There's nobody else to take care of her stuff. And like her, he was obsessed with keeping records. Most of what we know about the whaling industry in New London, or a lot of it, is because he kept meticulous records of every whaling voyage that ever went out, even his competing firm. She did the same thing. She kept meticulous records. Just to give you an example, Hawkins, one of the things she didn't talk about last week was Hawkins created a necrology. The intention of it was to record every single person that died in New London from the first settlement, 1646. Not just adults, stillborn babies, Kanakas, that is South Sea Islanders on whaling ships in the harbor who died. Guys that fell off the mast and hit the water or the deck and died. A lot of them didn't even know the names of people, or they said, oh, this guy was from England, or whatever. And in fact, it's interesting that in her necrology, she includes a very young infant child of Sarah Harris and George Fairweather, 1841. So, and why was she doing that? I think because she was part of that Second Great Awakening. These folks are very concerned about the state of people's souls. What is going to happen to you? After you die? Are you going to be saved? And it's important to keep track of the souls passing through a place like New London or Norwich. There's a similar necrology here, started by Lydia Huntley Sigourney. I think one of the reasons that is important for sort of African American studies and thinking about African Americans is, what's the importance of the soul? Is a male soul or a female soul or a black soul or a white soul more important than another? No, I don't think so. I think there is an equality there, and that's one of the things that comes out of the Second Great Awakening. Is, at least some recognition of that, at least on the level of souls. See a little bit more about that. So, in contrast, the Harris family was very large. You had a lot of members, a lot of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and so forth. The materials that they created, if they still survive, are scattered all over probably the country. A lot of them didn't survive. Exactly why, I don't know. I have some ideas as to why some of the materials that did survive, survived. And we'll say a little bit more about that. But we're really concerned, I'm going to talk not just about Mary and Sarah, but also about two other members of the family and their spouses. And Charles Floribal Harris, his wife Anne Marie Davis, and Celinda Harris and her husband William Anderson. And we can talk about others, but just stop that. It's too big a topic. Of course, one of the things about Prudence Crandall is that Prudence Crandall didn't just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to start a school for young ladies and little misses of color. No, she actually was kind of pushed into it by the Harris family. She had this servant, Anne Maria Davis, from the Boston area, who apparently helped out with the school, and they actually have sort of been soaking up some of the educational content. But she was dating Charles Floribal Harris. Harris was an agent for the Liberator. His dad and most of the family is living in Canterbury now, but they had just recently moved from Norwich. He's apparently still living in Norwich, but it's not really clear. It's only like 16 miles between the two places. It's relatively close. It's not that hard to get back and forth. So he's visiting her. He's an agent for the Liberator. This is very early in the career of the Liberator. The Liberator was almost exclusively supported in the early years by African Americans. They formed the majority of the subscribers. It was their subscriptions that really kept it going. So he is peddling this extremely volatile material, very controversial. He's kind of on the fringes of Prudence Crandall's household, and apparently it's because of him that Sarah Harris becomes acquainted with Prudence Crandall and makes, I guess as we would say today, the ask. Would you be willing to let me attend your school? I just want to get a little education so that I can teach people of my own color. People like me. And Crandall, wrestled over it, finally decided to admit her. The parents of the white students objected, and Crandall said, okay, I'm going to shut the school down. I'm going to reopen in April of 1833 for young ladies and misses of color. Advertises, of course, in the Liberator, which is a natural thing since she's gotten into this through Charles Harris and his sister. And one of the students that arrives is also Sarah's sister, Mary. Now, not only is there, so I don't think we're going to go through the whole story of how the townspeople kind of united against it. They got the state to pass a law, basically banning the school. the black law, how Prudence Crandall was arrested, the trial fails on a technicality, it's thrown out. The lawyers had hoped, in fact, to question the constitutionality of the black law. But by throwing out a technicality, that was never actually challenged. But it did become one of the citations in Brown versus the Board of Education. So this is a very important court case. You know, the arguments that they're using. Just to back up a little bit, so the Harrises, the founder of this little family, or rather large family, is William Monteflora or Montflora Harris. He is a fairly mysterious creature. We don't know much about him. In the early 1800s, he's a sailor on board ships. First decade or so of the 19th century, we have Seamen's Protection certificates for him, where he is listed as being a native or a citizen or whatever, is born in the United States, which of course affords him protection against seizure by the British or whoever. In reality, he apparently was born in Haiti. Remember, the Haitian Revolution that started in 1791. The Haitians had thrown off, the French. They had thrown off, efforts to, quash the rebellion. Napoleon sent troops over, and they defeated those. They had done it was the first real successful black slave revolution ever, and it was regarded here as being a very bad example. Haitians were not good people. You don't want Haitians around because they're going to spread that revolutionary fervor. It might be catching, and for God's sake, we don't want them here in this country. So he had pretty good reason not to say that he was born in Haiti. It would have put him under a great deal of suspicion and probably made him perhaps unemployable. And then he marries in London, gets divorced, remarries a woman from Griswold, Sally Prentice. We don't know much about Sally Prentice, except that in the family there was a story that she was an Indian maiden. And in the material at URI, some of the handwritten notes by descendants say, well, yes, my great-great-grandmother, an Indian maiden. That's hardly proof. But they carefully preserved the hair of Sally Prentice and hair of Sarah Fairweather, Sarah Harris Fairweather. Those are in little envelopes at the URI. It's not special collections anymore, it's distinctive collections. But anyways, he settles down in Norwich. We don't know how he earns a living. He's obviously got money because he begins purchasing property. He owns property right near where City Hall is now on Broadway. You might think, wow, that's pretty nice. But the fringes of the seaport town here were not pleasant places. There were like slaughterhouses, soap works, things like that. So, it wasn't a terribly nice neighborhood. It became nice later. He's buying, this in the 1816 into the 1820s. And he's buying that property from a variety of people. He's dealing with folks. One of them is Calvin Goddard, a local attorney whose father-in-law had written an anti-slavery sermon in 1774. Calvin Goddard is selling the property. He's also purchasing property in Norwich from people in Canterbury. This is prior to his moving to Canterbury. So obviously he's got some relationships here that, are important and actually become very important later on. So here we have a family that has property. You know, he purchases property in Canterbury, moves out there. You know, they obviously have resources because, you know, she's not offering to ask him to go to school for free. It's going to be paid for. She's not a kid, she's not a teenager, she's what, 20, 21 years old, Sarah Harris. And in fact, you know, I think it's ironic, if you go to the state capitol, you'll see a statue of Prudence Crandall with a student who's supposedly Sarah Harris. And the student looks like a young girl, quite a bit shorter than Prudence Crandall. No. She might have been taller than Prudence Crandall. You know, she's an adult woman. But I think it says something about us that we need to define that relationship between Prudence Crandall as being between a larger, you know, person and a smaller, younger person. But anyways, so Sarah, there's also, of course, this romance between Charles and Anne Maria Davis. There's also, though, a romance that develops up between Sarah Harris and George Fairweather. And the two couples get married in Canterbury in a joint ceremony in November of 1833. So Sarah is really only involved with the school for a relatively short time. She gets married. She and George settle around 1841 in London. And we don't know an awful lot about Sarah Harris's or Sarah Fairweather's life after that. We do have some letters. We know that she exchanged correspondence with Helen Benson Garrison. Canterbury School also, there was another romance, and that was the Benson family that were supporters of Crandall and the school and so forth. The daughter, Helen, became romantically involved with William Lloyd Garrison from the Liberator, and she marries William Lloyd Garrison. So, I've got three couples here. But she maintains a friendship and a relationship with Garrison for a long time. In 1863, she's actually, there's a letter from Helen Benson Garrison to Sarah Fairweather, where she says her son George, her oldest son, has decided he wants to join the army, because after all, this war is about freedom. It's 1863, Emancipation Proclamation has been put out. He wants to join. And what are his parents going to say? They've been fighting for freedom all this time. Yes, they're pacifists, but, you know, and so she says, well, maybe if you, they say, well, it'll be okay if you want to join like the 55th Massachusetts, or, you know, that would be okay, you know, a black regiment. I don't know actually whether or not George did. I don't think he did. It's interesting that, you know, the Garrisons were having this conflict, and they were sort of unburdening themselves to Sarah Fairweather. You know, unfortunately, we only have a couple of pieces of correspondence. We have some with Prudence Crandall, Garrison, one from her mother, and one from her to her daughter, Isabella, or Bella, or Belle. And those two letters, family letters, are in the 1850s, 20 years, more than 20 years after this. Those were saved, and I think because the letter to Bella is written on Bella's 16th birthday, from Kingston to Bella, who's apparently in New London, perhaps staying with Celinda, Sarah's sister. And she's very concerned. Bella's going to be going to school. She says, you need to keep up with all of your cousins and sisters and everything. So school is obviously an important thing. Sarah has actually purchased a piano in Providence and has brought it down to Kingston so that Bella will be able to play it when she comes home. Very, very interesting. The next letter, the other family letter that survives, is 1857, September 20th, 1857, and it's from Sally Harris, Sally Prentice, Sarah's mother, to her, talking about, the first thing she says, I hope to see all my children and grandchildren settled in life and comfortable and so forth, in this life. And I want to make sure that they are safe in the next life. So there's this concern for salvation. We don't get today, you read the Civil War letters of the Hempsteads. The Hempsteads one of them has a son in a Union regiment, and they're exchanging correspondence, and she is just scared to death. Not just that he might die in battle, but that he might die without having converted. To us today, that just seems like, why would you be concerned? But obviously, souls are very important to these folks. Anyways, the reason I think that letter survives is that less than 3 weeks later, Sally Prentice dies. So this might be the last letter that Sarah Harris Fairweather ever receives from her daughter. Her mother, sorry. Previous letter was good. Thank you. Her last letter from her mother, her daughter's letter from her mother when she turned 16. So those are sort of seminal events that are preserved. The interesting thing about the 1857 letter is it says, Mary, that is the sister Mary who is married, Helliman Williams, has taken up housekeeping in the brick house next to the new church, that is Dr. Gulliver's church. And that talks about, Arthur going to school, Albert going to school. Don't know any more details about that, but it places them right downtown, right across from the current City Hall, right next to the Broadway Congregational Church and Dr. Gulliver, who incidentally had just founded Norwich Free Academy. So perhaps there's a relationship here. Their son, their oldest son, Arthur P. Williams, that is Mary Harris Williams's and Helliman Williams' son. Arthur apparently goes to Norwich Free Academy. Our problem is that the early records of Norwich Free Academy really don't exist.
There's a fire.
What?
The fire that burned the original main building.
Yeah, they're gone.
Yeah.
But apparently Norwich Free Academy was in fact open to students of every race
Yes.
from the beginning. It's 20 years after Prudence Crandall. There's obviously been a major societal shift. Plus Gulliver is pretty staunch anti-slavery man himself. When they pass the Fugitive Slave Act, he compares it to the spirit of liberty being pinned to the pavement by government bayonet. When John Brown was executed December 2nd, 1859, he writes a sermon called The Lioness and Her Whelps, talking about slavery and how, this is just not an end. And when Lincoln comes and speaks on March 9th, 1860, he ends up in the train with Abraham Lincoln headed to, Bridgeport, and has this wonderful conversation with Lincoln that he later reports on. So Gulliver is a person who certainly would be sympathetic with Mary Harris and her interests. That's 1857. So what do we know about Sarah Harris's life? Sarah Harris Fairweather's life from 1833 until the 1850s? Almost nothing. She lives in London. Her husband, we know, is a delegate to the Convention of Colored Men in New Haven in 1849 that is seeking to end the clause in the Connecticut Constitution that says that only white males 21 years of age or older can vote, specifically white. And almost from the moment that had been passed in 1818, there were efforts to strike the word white, right up until the Civil War. It was actually a referendum during the war in 1864 where it fails. Norwich, it carries the motion or to strike the word white passes in Norwich overwhelmingly, but not in the rest of the state. So, yeah, interesting. But they're working on this. This is not only George Fairweather, but also some of the other male members of the family. So we know that's going on. We know that she is attending anti-slavery conventions. She is baking cakes and giving them to Helen Benson Garrison. Garrison mentions in her letter that she's kept the one cake that Sarah had baked for her for almost a year. I don't know how edible it was at that point, but
Probably a fruitcake.
Probably a fruitcake. It's supposed to get better, I think, with age. But I did find something very interesting in looking at the census. Unfortunately, the only census, the London census, that George Fairweather and Sarah Fairweather and their children show up in is in 1850, because they're too late for the 1840, and they've already left by the time of the 1860 census. So I looked at the 1850 census. There he is. He's a blacksmith. He's has $800 worth of real estate. He's got his wife, daughter Sarah, daughter Mary, daughter Isabel, that's Belle, George, who's 8, George H. Fairweather, George Harris Fairweather, and Charles Fairweather, who's 4. And all of the children are in attendance at school, except for the 4-year-old. In the same house, there's another family. And this is what actually astounded me, because I looked at the other family. Aaron Newby, 56 years old, black, a tanner, born in South Carolina, living in the same house with the Fairweathers. His wife Fanny, 33, born in Connecticut, and then all their children, they have, looks like 5 children, all born in Connecticut. So obviously he had married a girl from Connecticut after he came here and raised a family. One of the children's names is, the census record has this Surlinda. It's almost certainly Celinda, probably named after Celinda Harris Anderson. Celinda Dunn Anderson, one of the Harris sisters, one of the other Harris sisters. So huh, what is this? Is Newbie potentially an escaped slave? You know, what's this guy from South Carolina doing, living with the Fairweathers in New London in 1850? Don't know. But it's an interesting little sidebar. What is going on here? And I thought, well, perhaps he's a free person that moved up from South Carolina. The southern states were in fact not even encouraging, pushing free blacks out. They don't want them living in the South because, it sets a bad example for slaves. It gives enslaved people the idea that they too can achieve freedom somehow. So you eliminate free blacks. So that could be, or it's also possible that he is, in fact, an escaped slave. Why would an escaped slave put their birth state on the census? I don't know. It's curious, though, that James L. Smith, fugitive slave living here in Norwich in the 1850 census, reports himself as having been born in Virginia. So, is it that they just felt safe enough here that, or maybe the government reassured everyone then that the census data would be confidential? This is kind of a current topic, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, really, we don't know a lot more about what Sarah Harris was doing. There probably is more documentation out there. Her children, Bella marries. I think Bella's grandchild is living in Rhode Island in the early 20th century and is a piano teacher. Because in the files there are programs for little concerts that she does and so forth with her students. And her son also participates in those, into the 1920s. So I'll pick that theme up with the next person. We'll just talk a little, and I'm going to talk a little about Mary now, because Mary is probably the one person in this family who really manages to do something that is in keeping with the ideals of Prudence Crandall, the notion of the school and so forth. Mary marries Pelham Williams, we think from Springfield, Massachusetts. Pelham Williams attends Dartmouth College, 1841 to 1842. He does not graduate, but 1850, 51, he's teaching a school for colored children in the basement of a church, or class anyways, in the basement of a church in New Haven. He later moves back to Norwich. He lives with Mary on Broadway next to the Congregational Church of Dr. Gulliver. And they have 3 children. But in 1863, they move out. They leave Norwich. Where do they go? They go to occupied New Orleans.
Wow.
Yes. They moved to New Orleans specifically to engage in teaching former slaves. And they become involved in Straight University, which, unlike some of the other schools that are founded that educate former slaves and African Americans in the South, it has a strong teaching staff who are black. Whites as well, but they actually have a fair number of black instructors. Pelham Williams becomes the principal of the normal division of Straight University. In case you don't know what the normal division is, that is the division that teaches teachers to teach. So very consonant with those goals, and apparently his wife Mary is involved in that as well. And the irony of it is that the State University also has a board of trustees, which includes, at least I think in the 1870s, one of the members of the board of trustees of State University is a guy named George H. Fairweather, Sarah Fairweather's son.
Wow.
When the 1880 census is, his occupation is described as journalist. It's like, wow. Okay, so here's a very strong connection. It's ironic that this would be playing out in Louisiana and the South, that the members of this family are actually kind of going down there. In fact, when Sarah visits, Prudence Crandall, she has also visited her sister and brother-in-law, probably son as well, in New Orleans. But how do you find out more information about this? I guess field trips to New Orleans wouldn't be too bad. So the later history of the family is Arthur, who goes to NFA, perhaps, maybe. NFA doesn't have a record of it, but he claimed in his information that he gave out in New Orleans that he had attended Poetry Academy, so I believe him. He became involved in the New Orleans music scene. Interesting. There's one thing, the thread that I see running through this is music.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. And I'm wondering, one of my speculations here, and this is just speculation, are they finding music as something that they can get into and be teachers in and so forth, and kind of get around the problem of being a regular teacher? But music seems to be a really strong theme in this family, very strong theme. And eventually, the family, by the 20th century, early 20th century, has moved to Chicago. And actually, Chuck Piper, who would have been here today, but is not, is a descendant of the Mary Harris and Pellyman Williams. He was born in Chicago. I'll just tell you, this is a great story for those of you who haven't heard it. He was born in Chicago on the south side, in the black neighborhood. And his family moved out to an all-white community, farming community in Wisconsin when he was quite young, and raised him as white. So he had no idea that he had any African-American heritage whatsoever. Until he got a PhD in microbiology. He began to work for one of these big pharmaceutical companies, had to go to Europe for a conference, needed a passport, he had to get his birth certificate. The birth certificate says Negro.
Wow.
And he says, oh, this can't be right. So he goes down to the Chicago City Hall and he demands of the clerk, look, there's been a mistake. It says here, I'm Negro. I'm not. And the clerk, who was black, looked at him and said, I think maybe you better have a conversation with your parents.
Wow.
Yes. So he discovered that, in fact, he had, an entire bunch of relatives that knew about him, but he didn't know about them. So when he graduated, when he got his PhD, when he got married, all the life events, his parents would clip it out and send it to the relatives. And so at one point he meets some of the relatives. They know about him and all about him. They've got him in their clipping books and so forth, but he never even knew they existed.
How old is he now?
He's probably in the 70s.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Could be, yeah, the 70s. So, and here's the other ironic thing. And so one of his, they went to a Cab Calloway concert. And one of his, they sat in the front row. They were sitting next to an African-American lady, and they start chatting. And they, I think it's Judy, his wife, says, "Oh, you know, my husband's cousin is married to Cab Calloway." And the woman looks at him and says, "My cousin is married to Cab Calloway."
Oh, wow.
So they found out that in fact they were cousins. We had no idea. So, but again, there's sort of this musical theme here that seems to be repeating. So one of the real challenges is Chuck and Judy have been trying to find out more information about the Palliman Williams, where did he come from, and so forth. And so far, I've been trying to help them. We've pretty much run into a blank wall. We do know he's listed as, his occupation is listed as a teacher. Apparently, he was, at least at one point, a teacher of penmanship. Again, kind of a niche.
Yeah.
Also, a very important skill in the 19th century, before typewriters came around, things like that. And I just have this funny feeling, if you go into the city clerk's office, some of the birth and death records have been, written very carefully in script, a fair number of years. And obviously someone has done them over and written them out in a rather nice script. I'm kind of thinking, could that have been Palliman Williams? Just speculation on my part. But, so we don't really know much about him. Very little. What his origins are. We know that there was a Peggy Williams who lived on Jail Hill in the 1830s, who died in the early 1840s, very poor, basically lived in a shack, had just a minimal estate. We think that he might have been her son, but we don't know. We think there was a relationship there, but we're really not sure. And how do we find out? So that's Sarah.
That's Mary.
Now we get to Mary. Mary, oh wait, no, that's Mary.
Mary,
yeah.
Back to Mary. Let's get to Charles. Charles, of course, marries Anne Maria Davis. They settle in Norwich. He becomes a restaurateur, has a Vivian saloon right down here on Market Street, near where Lostello's is now, but not in the same building. That building he occupied is long gone. He's apparently a fairly successful restaurateur and dies during the Civil War. His middle name is Floraval. His dad's middle name was Monteflora. I'm wondering if perhaps those are names from Haiti. They reflect their Haitian origins, or
probably, phonetically spelled memories.
well, yes, because you'll see that in Sarah's family, her daughter Isabella, her middle name is Montflora. So you'll see it's spelled Monteflora, Montflora, Montflora, and that Montflora actually continues in the 20th century. So it is used as a middle name in this family. So Charles and Anne Maria have a small family. They take in a young man named Jacob Caesar Benjamin, who's actually from the island of St. Helena. He has gotten here by basically working on a dye ship, bringing in dye stuffs, dye wood from South America to the Johnson Dye Works in Uncasville to dye textile fabrics. He works for a while, basically doing sort of water ferrying and that kind of thing, and then he starts working for Charles Thorwald Harris in his restaurant, and eventually marries his daughter, Gertrude, and they he sets up his own restaurant. And Jacob Caesar Benjamin by the 1880s is perhaps the best known caterer in Norwich. He's the guy you go to if you want to have a big party. He does actually very well. And in 1891, his daughter, or he and his wife's daughter, marries Ellsworth Bruce. Maud Benjamin marries Ellsworth Bruce in 1891 on Grove Street, right off Franklin Street. And the accounts of it is this is a brilliant wedding. They have an orchestra playing. They have the house is completely redecorated with potted plants. They have like wolfskin rugs, things like that. They actually build a bower attached to the house, and the description of the wedding dresses and the bridesmaids' outfits and the gifts, gold-plated, dinnerware, that kind of thing, fabulous. Guests from New Orleans, from Savannah, Georgia, from Santo Domingo, from Boston, Massachusetts, this is like a social event. So this is a family that has done very well and is really, showing. The child of this union of Maud Benjamin and Ellsworth Bruce, his name is Benjamin Bruce. They combined the two names. Benjamin Bruce goes to NFA, and he is apparently an absolutely outstanding student and individual. I looked him up in the Library of Congress chronicling America from 1909 to 1922. The bulletin is available online at the Library of Congress chronicling America. And you can do a search. Put in Benjamin M. Bruce and Benjamin Montgomery Bruce, 62 citations in that period.
Wow.
I'll just give you a few examples of what he's doing. So in 1912, he's the vice president of the Young Men's Bible class of Christ Episcopal Church. He's elected as the a Boy Scout official. He's actually in charge. He leads the Scouts in the Memorial Day Parade, I think in 1950 and 1960, 124 Boy Scouts. He's at the head of the parade. World War I breaks out. He organizes a drive with the Boy Scouts. They raise $50,000 in Liberty bonds. That's a huge sum of money. Multiply that by about 30 times.
Yeah.
We've got some idea. They're $1.5 million in today's dollars. It's fabulous. This guy was just astounding. 1916 Memorial Day Parade. 1912, he did a paper on, this is ironic because remember, the Harrises started out apparently in Sunday school over here in Norwich in the Second Congregational Church. So here 100 years later, their descendant has written a paper which he reads at a conference, Sunday school conference, on how we can increase the boys' membership in the Sunday school. He becomes a paid secretary at the YMCA. Here he is, he's African American.
Yeah.
You know, he arranges in 1915 for the distribution of Christmas baskets for the poor with the Salvation Army. This is a guy who's really, you know, visits the Pearl Street School with two of the GAR members. You know, it's just presides over the Scoutmaster Roundtable. He's later elected president. Here's a guy who is really going somewhere. And he's a descendant of Charles Harris and Anne Marie Davis. But this is where I think it gets difficult. 1912, he's very much involved in the Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA. 1912, the YMCA puts on the Camp Comfort Minstrels.
Mhm.
That's camp spelled with a K, comfort spelled with a K. It's a minstrel show. The minstrel troupe ranged on stage in the approved form with the end men in blackface. And Benjamin Bruce, you know, has to sing a song in this. He's the first tenor in this whole thing and so forth. You wonder, you know, how this must have,
Yeah.
did this affect him? I mean, this is really, it's pretty bad. So, 1918, Benjamin Bruce takes a job in Washington, D.C. with the War Bureau. Moves down to Washington, and then after a few months, he switches over to the Export Bureau. You know, in charge, you know, having to deal with export of goods, emissions, whatever. And then surprise, in February 1918, his friends in Norwich received a notice that he has married. He has married a young woman from Cambridge, Ohio, Georgiana Shipman, in a private ceremony unattended at her sister's house in Cambridge, Ohio. And everyone in Norwich is like, oh, why didn't we find out about this? Well, the answer is that Georgiana Shipman is white.
Wow.
He is passing himself off as white. He is passing. And in fact, in the course of doing all the sort of various research I've been doing over the years, I contacted his son,
Wow.
who lives in Colorado, and his son said, I started doing, he said, the family genealogy, and the Bruces came from Arlington, Virginia. I walked into the library, they handed me the Bruce genealogy. He says, I was knocked over to discover that the Bruces were black. Well, actually not, but part black, part Scottish, and whatever else,
Yeah.
but they had African American roots. And he had absolutely no idea. And his father had basically relocated to Chicago, pretty much cut off his ties with folks in Norwich, except for one guy from Norwich who was in charge of sporting goods department at Marshall Field department store. And apparently he swore him to secrecy, but no one ever suspected he had any African American. If I had, sorry I don't have photographs, but if I had a photograph of him, you think, well, maybe he's Italian or Mediterranean, or, you can't really tell what his ethnicity is. It's so important to us. But that's another reason, I think, why it's hard to find material. A number of these families, like Charles Piper's family, like Benjamin Montgomery Bruce, decided, in fact, to conceal the fact that they had black ancestors. And when you're doing that, you don't want to have a lot of documentation about your family around. You don't tell your children about it. And in fact, We have another family that are descended from Guy Drock, a enslaved blacksmith here in the 1700s. Over the years, they intermarried, and by the 20th century, they had established an identity as DeRoche, or DeRock, or and told their children that they were descended from soldiers who came over with Lafayette, more pirates who were with Lafitte at the Battle of New Orleans, or some such story. But obviously, in cases like that, you conceal information about your family background. And one can see why, Benjamin Bruce might have been, with things like the Camp Comfort minstrels. I can't imagine that it must not have been painful for him. One last person, and that is Celinda Anderson, who you probably haven't heard of, but she is one of the sisters who had Sarah, born in 1812, her sister Mary, born in 1814, and then Celinda is 1816. Celinda married William Anderson from New London. William was actually descended from people that were enslaved in New London in the 1700s. Got actually a pretty good lineage of that. William was a delegate to the 1849 convention, the Colored Men's Convention. He was a barber, very common trade among African Americans at the time, barbers, blacksmiths, and then things like carting and very menial jobs as well. But I found in all right, in 1855, William Nell produced a book called The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. In it, he talked about the contributions of blacks in the American Revolution. And who should he quote in this book but William Anderson, whose grandmother's brother had been at the Battle of Fort Griswold. And 1853, they had a big celebration at Fort Griswold. They had the descendant of John Winthrop come down, give a big speech, and so forth. And Anderson said, hey, wait a minute. We gave our lives for this. Nambo Latham and Freeman Jordan, basically died, were slaughtered in the massacre when the British took the fort. They, fought like tigers, he said, and yet now, we don't even have the right to vote. He said, foreigners can come in here and get the right to vote. People who fought against us in the War of 1812 got the right to vote, but what about us? It's actually a very, very appropriate thing. So he was, obviously married to Celinda. Celinda, on the other hand, was a member of the Second Congregational Church in New London, along with one of the Hempstead girls, and was married. They became what were called come-outers. I don't know if anyone has heard of the term come-outer. In the anti-slavery movement, there were various fractions or factions in the movement. One of them was the come-outers. The come-outers were among the more radical. The come-outers like to go into a church and denounce the church for, in fact, not taking a stand against slavery. And in fact, that's what Celinda Anderson and her white friend did. They went and said, hey, you're not taking a stand against slavery. We resign from the church in protest against what you're doing. So a pretty, radical move at the time. So this is a family of folks who are activists and who are willing to put, their reputations and their comfort on the line. It's probably no accident that Aaron Newby's 4-year-old is named Celinda Newby. I'm sure that they are admiring her for what she has done. But, the frustrating thing is there's got to be a lot more to this. We just don't know. You multiply this by all the other descendants of the Harrises. There are probably many descendants who are not even aware that they are. But I think these things do tend to run in families. And, we tend to think of anti-slavery, Underground Railroad, and abolition as being the province of white people and of middle-class whites like ourselves. And the truth really is that just isn't the case. Most people that were involved in this were African American. They had the most at stake, and they were taking the greatest risk. And in fact, not only that, but in many cases, they were, their white accomplices, people that worked with them, many of them were working class people, tradesmen, tanners, leather workers. Thomas Wentworth Higginson says in his Cheerful Yesterdays that you could trace radicalism in America by the smell of leather. Wherever there was like a tanner or a shoemaker or whatever, leather was, the smell leather around. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Now, Aaron Newby, tanner.
John Brown.
John Brown,
Yes.
tanner. Jesse Grant, Ulysses S. Grant's anti-slavery dad, tanner. And who did Jesse Grant know well? The Brown family. He was actually acquainted with the Browns. They all came together. James Lindsay Smith, fugitive slave living here in Norwich, 1840s, shoemaker. Who hires him, gives him work making shoes? It's the Bidwell family and other shoemakers in Norwich helped support this guy. Case, David Case, an officer in one of the black regiments in Louisiana. From Norwich, Case family are Morocco tanners up on Case Street. He says in a letter to the Norwich Bulletin in 1863 that we just have to get rid of this idea that blacks are inferior to whites. Pretty radical thing.
Yeah.
They make just as good soldiers as whites. So, David Case. His brother had been the first casualty from Norwich in the Civil War. Think of William, was it Box Brown?
Yeah.
Remember Box Brown? The guy who escaped from slavery by being nailed into an express box and sent to actually an address next door to anti-slavery headquarters in Philadelphia. Who nails him into the box? A shoemaker, a white shoemaker. So anyways. But no, and here are these, the Fairweathers are blacksmiths, they are tradespeople. Look at where George Fairweather is living. There are other blacksmiths, white blacksmiths all around him. we tend to think that folks involved in all this stuff were just like us, and they weren't necessarily so. And the other thing is that I think behind a lot of these things, there's always someone who is black who is pushing. So for instance, Calvin Goddard, okay, his father-in-law did like the first anti-slavery sermon in Connecticut, 1774. Okay. 1816, he's selling land to William Harris. Okay. Shortly after that, he's representing black pensioners from the Revolution to get pensions from the U.S. government, 19 of them. Prudence Crandall gets arrested. The case goes up to the Connecticut Supreme Court. Who represents Prudence Crandall? One of the lawyers is Calvin Goddard. So there, I mean, and that's, but Calvin is obviously having contacts with black families or black individuals over a long period of time. And how is that driving what he's doing? No. So I think one of the problems I have is when you're looking at this, you have to, what is actually behind this? What is the motive behind this? Just another quick example, Henry B. Stanton, one of the big guns in the anti-slavery movement, was born in, I think it was Griswold or Voluntown, early 1800s. He talks about, in his random recollections, about a black servant